Yes. No, it does. And I think this is a little less potentially controversial when it comes to theistic proofs because like we made clear in our previous episodes, we both accept the validity of all of the theistic proofs. And I'd say that until you get to an issue as particular as creation, at creation evolution, you don't really see the difference between these two approaches in really stark display. And before, I think it's still there. And I haven't thought through entirely if I were to take those three that we went through, for example, where I would put them in the train of an apologetic presentation. Because it sounds like you would basically start with those, right?
Yes, because I think it would build very nicely into the presentation of the fallen human sinfulness.
Okay, but obviously, by definition, in order for someone to embrace the message of the gospel, you would have to reason. However, we may interpret the particulars of the gospel differently. You would have to eventually make that transition, let's call it. I don't want to use a pejorative term, into things that only Scripture could bring us.
Yeah, I see it more as a stairway. You know what I mean? You take the first step of the existence of God. The next step is justice, injustice, evil, the fall, behavior. That's kind of a universal principle as well. People know that, and that's kind of the basis of basically the entire field of ethical philosophy. That's the entire justification for the legal system. Everyone is constantly operating off of this idea of right and wrong, kind of all the time. Basically, we live in a moral world. I would take that step to kind of moving into the historical presentation that Jesus was who he said he was. But before you need to do that, you need to make a case that the Gospels are historical documents. So gospel is historic. The Gospels are historic documents. Jesus is who he says he was. And maybe I myself would go and justify the Old Testament based off of the New Testament. I think it's easier to do that than to do it the other way around. But this is just a more discussion of apologetic methodology at that point.
Right, and to be clear, I'm not. This is a long roundabout process, but I'm eventually getting back to creation evolution because I think up until that point, the two methods can kind of lock arm in arm and complement each other. But once you get to the question of origins, they completely diverge. And I say that as a creationist or a literal creationist, because what you were describing, it's not necessarily the method I was at least trained to take. Mine was more, here's the gospel, here are the claims of the gospel. Let's put that out there and then allow the questions and objections to flow from that. And then along the way, you can, if you're going to take an active step in the conversation, you can bring in these theistic proofs to show how this person who is coming from a diametrically opposed position is ultimately unable to deny what you were talking about, Paul saying that the invisible things, attributes of God are clearly seen in the creation. And that I think you see it more as walking the person step by step up to the gospel. And I would see it more as sort of getting them to a point where they can't deny the gospel. And it's funny because I take a very gentle and laid back and diplomatic approach to things. And maybe that's in part to compensate for the fact that the method I was trained into is rather aggressive compared to the one that you use, especially.
Yeah, I also think the interesting thing that springs to mind is the circumstances of evangelization determine how you're doing this, right? So I think if you're a pastor or a professional apologist, this is going to be a conversation you're going to be centering your life around, right? And for the layman or for the workaday individual, the way we're going to step into those conversations are going to be very different.
Yes. And I think that, and we'll really get into this in the next episode when we asked the question of how does apologetics connect to the daily life of a believer. But for now, I certainly agree you have to tailor your presentation to every situation.